So I want to kick off by asking the very basic question, which is the question that hopefully we will have addressed by the end of this panel. What are the specific types of data that the public cares about? How do we know that they care about this kind of data? Why do they need this data? What can they do with it? And are there any success stories that our panelists can share with us about putting data in front of people and them using it in an active and engaged way? I'm going to start with Irene because I met her first, so I'm picking on her. And also she's got experience with working with the Parliamentary Monitoring Group in Uganda. So she's dealt with this question on a regular basis about what kind of data does the public care about. Irene, could you kick us off?
Thank you. Well, I mean, that's an interesting question. And when you look at data demand, what is it? How do you define it when you look at it in relation to citizens? And I'll mostly be sharing, of course, from my perspectives in working with monitoring Uganda's parliament. And I think from my experience, the most important thing I have learned is that data in itself alone cannot determine demand. So before putting out the data, there's no group of people sitting and waiting and saying, you know, we want this data, therefore you should put up this data. And I think looking at that approach in looking at demand is a bit flawed. When we're looking at data demand, we need to look at not just the data, but looking at also the availability and effective use and impact. So my experience with Parliament is that at the beginning, when we set up the website, for example, we put up all this information about Parliament, understanding the petitions, the processes, information about bills. And so what we did was to set up social media where we would use the social media to promote the information on the website. And so we'll say, you know, here is a bill that was tabled yesterday. And you'd get a number of retweets where people say, oh, the bill is here. But when you'd go back and check, you'd find that no one actually went to the website to read the bill. And so we had to sit down and reevaluate because in the discussions that we had with people, there was a genuine concern about wanting to know what was being discussed in Parliament. However, when we did avail information about what was being discussed, people were not consuming it in the way that we thought. So we mostly had journalists using this information, big organizations, researchers, and for the researchers, a lot of researchers were not from Uganda. And so then the question was, what do ordinary citizens want? Because they keep saying, we want information, we want to know what's going on in Parliament. But when the information was availed, no one was really using it. However, we started to see a change when we started to have a live Twitter feed from Parliament. And then suddenly the interest changed. And so we started by tweeting discussions from a particular plenary discussion or a particular committee that we thought was a hot topic of that day. And then we started to get a lot of feedback and people started to respond and the followers started to increase. And then people started saying, well, you know, it's not just enough for you to tweet or to share information from the big committees like the accountability committees. We also want to know what's going on in the education committee. What are the discussions? And so we found that for a lot of people, they were more interested in knowing the faces behind the discussions that were going on in Parliament. And so they're asking, which MP pushed for this argument? What are they saying when they're discussing a bill on HIV/AIDS? What are they saying when they're discussing the budget? When you share the budget in itself, there was no interest. However, when you then go ahead to say, this MP argues this for this budget and that MP argues that, then the interest generates and they say, well, you know, that's not right. This is how we perceive it. And then more and more discussion and interest was generated in that way. And that's how we managed to get a following. And so I think for demand, then the issue becomes going beyond counting data sets and looking at how the use is. And therefore the question when you're looking at data demand is really looking at it from an economics perspective. And so when, for example, you're creating a new product, and this is my own argument and perception about it, when you're creating a new product like toothpaste in a supermarket, how do you ensure that someone is going to pick your brand over the other one? So we have information, and obviously we need this information out there, but then how do you ensure that there's demand for the particular information that you're putting out there? In order to do that, you then have to empower the citizens to be able to appreciate how they are going to use that data. If we have data from South Africa about ghost workers, so what? How is that relevant? For you to be able to create demand for that, you need to be able to tie the link between the ghost worker and the taxes of the citizen and how that affects service delivery to the citizen. Then once they start to appreciate that, demand grows. And I think for a lot of data, open data in Africa, that's the gap that we've been having.
Thank you very much. Let me just say that being a ghost worker in South Africa is very aspirational, actually. The hours are really good. Maybe I should turn to Gbenga and ask him, if I'm not putting you on the spot, can you give us some examples of a great data, liberation of data project that's worked, and maybe one that hasn't worked?
Okay, so one that hasn't worked, for example, will be, unfortunately, I'm going to use a government example that hasn't worked. I know that's kind of stereotyping, but there are a lot of it.
It's okay, all the government people have gone home already, I would imagine.
Okay, so the example that I'll give is in terms of education policy in Nigeria. And one of the things that data does is it allows you to understand the landscape and be able to make projections. And I know that we've got policy gaps where, you appoint a minister and then the government leaves and a new minister comes. And what we've seen is that almost every year when the results for exams are released, there's a national conversation around failure, around the fact that, oh my God, certain set of students failed these exams and all that. And we've seen where data on tertiary institutions particularly was gathered, and there was a process where that should have informed policy. And one of the suggestions was that some tertiary institutions will be upgraded from, say, polytechnics, for example, to become universities. And the problem with that was that it wasn't a demand-driven decision. It was a decision based on perception. Unfortunately, the perception is if you attend a polytechnic, you are not as smart as someone who attends a university. And so there was a temptation to upgrade institutions to all become universities so that all the graduates will be at the same level. And I think that the failure in that in itself was the fact that it wasn't built on any authentic data. It was built on assumptions, and that primarily was why it failed. And I think, and before I give the example of one that worked, apart from government, one other area in business where we've seen a lot of failure based on assumptions is if you look at businesses in Nigeria, and I'm speaking mostly of informal businesses. So if someone opens a shop somewhere and is selling shoes, in a few days, someone else will open a shop next to that same person. And so at the end of a month, you would have a whole row of shops selling the same thing. And what they've done is basically they've seen that this guy has started selling this stuff, and it's kind of making some sales. And there's no empirical data to work with, so the assumption is if I also do this business, I will be able to go there and make some money. And of course, what that means is you've got about 15 people selling the same product on the same street, so everyone who comes there, there's competition on where to buy. So that's another way where we have failure. But speaking of success, I think we're beginning to see a lot of success in building platforms. Another example I will give is also in education, where someone has built a mobile app based on reliable data on the subject. So there was a study on which subjects students needed help with, of course, the usual subjects, mathematics, English, and all that. And what it did was to build an app based on that information on the kind of content. So the content that this app was built on was based on the result of the study that they did. And I think this is where data demand, well, of course, we say the customer is king, but I want to say here that where the data is actually the real king here, because you're building what you're building around available data. I gave the example on the earlier panel of the health data sets, for example, and of course I wasn't referring to private health data, personal data. I was referring to how we can use existing data to identify gaps. If you're going to build a product on education and someone has built exactly the same thing, you probably have a better chance at building something where people have not built something. A very simple example is in the demand for Nollywood movies. I don't know how many people in the room have watched Nigerian movies. They're really big out there right now, okay? And someone came into the market and provided the opportunity for people to watch these movies, not on TV, but on their mobile phones. Now, that was based on the fact that, so they did a study and realized that a certain amount of data was consumed on watching YouTube to watch illegal versions of these movies over a period of time. Now, that data was what provided the opportunity for this company to start, legal streaming of Nollywood movies, and it's no surprise that they've become a big success right now. So where we see most failures is where assumption is taken as the basis for decision making. But we've seen a lot more success where real data that has been, especially data that has been accrued over a period of time, can allow you to do a lot of scenario planning and be able to get real work done.
In fact, just going back to your comment about your panel this morning, where you made the point about health data, and some of the panelists immediately jumped on it, using the argument that we can't liberate all data because it invades privacy. Do you think that this argument that governments started to make around we're protecting the privacy of our citizens is just a sham, it's just an excuse for them to be able to not make data available?
Many times it is. So no, I don't think anyone who wants to use data sets to build products for health is asking for people to release their private information to say what health problems do you have. The data sets that you need are probably things around performance of the hospitals, locations of the hospitals, nothing really private. So in instances where you have governments that readily say, we can't release this data because it's private, then I think it's either of two things. It's either there's a misunderstanding of the demand, okay? Because the demand is not really for the private information. The demand is for a better understanding of what, for an overused word, by the way, ecosystem. To understand what the ecosystem is like, how many players do we have, where are they playing, at what level, and understand exactly what the value chain is like. Or the second option is governments that are really scared of opening up data. Because what we've seen, and this is what happens, is once you open up your data, there will be more questions. And once there are more questions, particularly when when you open up the data and when there's more internet access, it means that many more citizens will be able to ask questions. So there are times when governments naturally just say, we don't want to release this because it's private information. But really, nobody is asking for private information that would, release details that people shouldn't release anyway. It's mostly around information to understand the ecosystem better. So I think there's no reason really why anyone should be scared of that.
And if we did want private data, we'd ask the Americans anyway, not anybody else, like Google. By the way, if any panelists want to just chip in here, I don't really want to be the ringmaster, so if anybody wants to chip in on some of these answers, please do. So another question, because there's always a tendency to assume that governments and, in fact, corporations who refuse to release data are doing so for some kind of ulterior motive. Is there also a question of capacity? I mean, what are the problems that are involved with actually releasing data if you are a government? Is it a resource squeeze? What is the problem? I don't know if you perhaps care to comment on that, Dr. Mshina.
Yes. Yeah, thank you very much, and sorry for being late. I think it's the question of, first of all, to build a culture of using data for making informed decisions. This is something which is new. And unfortunately, we have seen a lot of initiative of supporting my friend, the Paradigm Initiative, in terms of civil society who really question the government every time on particular services. The efforts are not proportional also to the efforts which have been going on in the government side of building the capacity of making sure that the data which is being produced are of good quality and how to use it for making informed decision. As a result, you find that the government is generating a lot of data, but nobody has questioned the quality of data unless you start to clean And not always people have possibility to look at the clean data and then they say, okay, how are you going to make use of it? That's one of the problem. And the question is, then you wonder, the question will be, how do you make a decision in terms of providing services? This will go again upon the demand, what the people actually want, the services. But what is interesting is, first we have to look at the demand of data. The citizens are mainly interested not on the data, they are mainly interested on services. I want to access health services, I want to access water services and education services. Is the government providing these services? So what has happened in Tanzania over the years is when we have drug supplies, the information on drug supply is actually put in the health facilities. Yes, we have this stock of drugs. So that's the one which people are mainly interested on. And then if you are, and then the other aspect is now with empowering people to demand services, then they want, they are mainly interested what is budget allocation for our own districts. There we need also to continue to build capacities of councillors to be able to understand what resources are coming up to our constituencies and how those resources are being utilized. We have made also efforts in Tanzania of making the figures on the budget or funding which is going to the health facilities, to education facilities, well known to the public. We have community committees which are mainly responsible to look after those issues. But those need to be strengthened to really understand more about not only doing things for helping communities to be able to understand what kind of services are being offered, but also being accountable to that particular services. And then you have at the district levels where most of the policies are translated into action on budget allocation. How do you allocate resources based on decisions and which services are being offered? So those are the things which are happening. And the big challenge we have now at a much higher level, how do you build capacity for the government to use data for making informed decisions? So the capacity is the capacity to generate good quality data and also to use the data for making informed choices. That's where I see still a problem.
It occurs to me that we might think we are speaking the same language, but in fact are not. Have we all reached a consensus on what the word data actually means here? Because I was listening to the Statistician General of South Africa this morning, representing my country, and saying that data should only be released in a structured form. I think that's the thing he said. Which, to me, that is anathema. I mean, data should be released and then structured by the user according to what the user wants to get out of it. So would somebody like to venture a definition of what they mean by data in the term understanding data demand? Would you like to? Oh, we have a volunteer. How would you define data? What are we talking about here?
Yeah, so I think that just like with everything else, you know, the academic kind of empirical, rigorous world is always trailing behind the practice. And the way that we understand data is so old, and that it cannot be applied in the way that we understand how information and information products and knowledge are used. So for somebody to say that, you know, data has to be structured, it has to be in some Excel spreadsheet, and that a PDF is not data, stuff that we put out in Facebook is not data, I think is really really dated. But what I would like to say is that, in my view, this session is really at the heart of this conference. It's about understanding demand. I think we've been dwelling too much on the supply side of things. And we just want to throw out stuff there at some homogeneous user community and that they all figure out. I think we need to understand that there will be the demand for data will be as diverse as the potential number of permutations of users as there could be. And that there is a fundamental assumption that the user community has some specific, concrete measurable need for information, data, or knowledge. Okay, and that while we assume that there is a need, there's also a presumption that there is an understanding of practical public or private interests. And that is where it comes to what is it that somebody wants the information for? Is it to hold government accountable? Is it to understand what kinds of resources are allocated to their community? Is it to enable them to participate in the debate? Is it to enlighten them and create some informed engagement in public participation, in public discourse? So I think that just like, for instance, if you go out to shop for anything, a dress or a shirt or a car or something, it is assumed that you know what you want. You know what color of a car you want, you know what engine capacity you want, you know what model of a car you want. You have in your mind what you're going to use this car for. So I think one of the things that we need to begin to understand in this space is that as we drive the open data conversation, we should also be aware that we should also try and work with the user community potentially to raise their level of sophistication in terms of data literacy, understanding, and being more sophisticated about the questions that they ask. Because data is not going to tell you anything until you speak to it, until you ask something of that data. So again, to the extent that the supply side of the house is very enthusiastic about what they want to put out there, I think it would be presumptuous on our part to suppose that the user community out there will take anything. So we should begin to have this kind of measured debate that understands that demand, just like in medicine, you go to a doctor and there is a diagnosis. And that diagnosis then leads to a prescription. Okay? And the doctor has an array of possible drugs that they might prescribe for you. And there's a methodic process at arriving at that. So we need to figure out whether we're going to create a slew of information and knowledge products that the user community will interact with and will use as appropriately as they want to use. So that's what I wanted to say.
Yes, in fact, Dr. Mashinda made a very good point about services as data. And of course, not everybody is online, and they are online for different values of online in terms of can they afford data, that kind of thing. Are there any kinds of examples of accessing data that exists not in the online world? Are there any examples of using data to create something in the non-online world, which used to be called the real world, which have worked for any of the panelists? You can't hear. It doesn't work. Maybe we should get a tech to work on the echo. I was saying, are there any examples of data projects or useful data that have been implemented in an offline scenario? Yeah.
I wouldn't say that we have enough of that offline. And one of the issues that I wanted to talk about, particularly in terms of what is happening in Tanzania, is that, and I think in most of developing nations, we tend to produce data for academicians and the likes. So whenever data is being produced, it's being produced necessarily for researchers, academicians, and then after we do that, we tend to complain that there is no demand for data. And I think that's where the problem is. I work for Rapport, and one of the things we do is to do research and release some data out there. When we release very academic structured data, nobody gets to be interested in anything that we're releasing. But when we take a bit of a summary of that data and put it in a very short version in Twitter or Facebook, all of a sudden you find everyone coming up. And that makes me think about the nature of data that we want to put out there. I think it's high time that we ourselves as researchers, as academicians, started to ask ourselves what is our targeted audience? Is it the researchers? Is it the policymakers? Is it ordinary people out there? If it's ordinary people, if we want to reach the masses, we have to agree on the type and shape of data that these people can really absorb and make use of it. Having numbers and wonderful graphs and I'm econometricians, having models doesn't say anything to them. So I think it's a challenge now that, as far as I'm concerned, and this is my opinion, that we can actually create demand for data if our data is very user-friendly. If we can make an ordinary person look at the data and make sense out of it, at its simplicity, I think we have an opportunity to change the way things are. We have been talking about governments not being able to make informed decisions based on real data out there. But is the data that we are producing user-friendly? Are we able to produce data that someone without a PhD can look at it and make sense of it? My friend from Nigeria was talking about someone starting a shop next to a shop just because another person has started a shop, and all of a sudden you have got 30 shops in one street. I tell you what, I think that makes logic to me, because to them, they've got no data. The only data they see and they can try to understand is someone making profit by selling fish. That's the data that he can understand. And that's what he will use. He will start a fish shop. And another person will do the same. Why? Because that's what they can get. That's what they can understand at that particular point. Now, if we go to all these sorts of data that we are producing and get back and say, you know what, the data that we are producing is not for researchers. It's not for academicians. It's for people out there to understand what is going on. It be for social issues, economic issues, and what have you. If we can get to that level, I think we will see the demand of data all of a sudden going up. I want to reiterate by saying the demand is out there, but the data that you are putting out there is not user-friendly. As a result, you don't expect people to come out and make use of it. And if they try, they will always be misled, because we tend to be too academic, too sophisticated. We tend to talk to one another as academicians and as researchers, and we forget, that it's not about researchers, it's not about academicians, it's about policymakers, it's about someone who will be implementing this thing somewhere in a village, someone who has hardly gone to a secondary school. And we have to get to their level if we have to have any impact. And this is the kind of data that I think, if we start thinking about it, if we start thinking about producing that kind of data that an ordinary citizen can understand, then we'll get to the position where the demand will rise and a lot of informed decisions will be made.
Chris, if I can quickly loop in to what Dr. Kiondo has said. And I think you bring a very interesting perspective about understanding the demand and how it will be used by the end user. And a very important aspect, I think, in understanding data demand is knowing who is going to be the end user of the data that you're producing. And I just, based on his submission, wanted to share an example from Uganda. In Uganda, over the years, every year, and I think this happens in a number of other countries, there's a budget speech where they share information about the budget. And the Minister of Finance comes and reads the national budget. When I was much younger, about maybe 5, 6 years old, the budget speech was a national holiday. And so a lot of people wouldn't really work, or if they're working, they're listening to their radios. Because in this budget, during the budget speech, you'd know how much tax was going on sugar, whether teacher salaries were going up, how much money was going to reach the local council. And so you'd kind of get a sense of the expenses of the years. Of course, over the years, the economy has developed, priorities have changed. And so there's more focus on macroeconomics. And so now when they reach the Uganda national budget, it's based on the National Development Plan, where our focus is on infrastructure and energy and investment. And so, of course, when they read the budget priorities, It's become much more complex than it was 20 years ago, 25 years ago. And so then a solution, so people started to complain about not enjoying it, you know? So even when you watch the news, you see even ministers and MPs dozing on TV. And there was a very creative group that came up that supported the Ministry of Finance to come up with a website called Know Your Budget. And this website really breaks down the information of the budget to the last detail, including how much money goes to your village, to a borehole. However, there's so much information, and which is great for a particular set of users, because as a researcher, it helps you because you know exactly what you're going to go and look for. But I attended a Mozilla Fest with one of the creators of the website, and they said the biggest challenge was that there are not enough citizens going to use the website for information. And when we went out, we were doing a campaign around the budget, this last budget we had, we're asking people, are you not interested in the budget? And everyone we talked to and interviewed said, no, we are interested in the budget. We want to know about the budget. But the information that's out there is too technical. When you ask people, a number of students we asked said, look, I just want to know if they're going to remove taxes on computers or school fees will be less. When you talk to farmers, they're like, you know, I want to know if there's going to be tax on sugar. I want to know if salaries are going up. But because of how complex a system has become, no matter how much you break it down, it still doesn't meet the need that they have. And so now, even though people still watch the budget speech has become now a chance for people to see what politicians are dosing. And it's become a big public spectacle and has lost the value that it had because we failed to be able to provide the simplistic information that people want around the budget.
I mean, on that note, how would you define an ideal user of a piece of data journalism or a data tool? Like, who's the ideal user that you guys would think of in terms of who you produce these products for? I mean, anybody can answer.
Okay. Well, I think the ideal user, again, depends on what problem you're trying to solve. Because you can't get information, you can't develop data that makes everyone happy. And so you have to have a target group in terms of who exactly is going to use this information. By having an ideal user in mind, and then understanding what information they would be looking for would be relevant for them, and how that information would then be actionable on their part, then it becomes easy for you to then build the data within that regard. So for example, the way you develop data sets for researchers or highly technical people in a particular sector is completely different from the way you develop data sets for teachers. It's completely different for the way you develop data sets for university students. And maybe I can use an example of Parliament Watch. So for Parliament Watch in Uganda, we've noticed that the people who use our products are very different, broken down into two. So there's a group that knows exactly what they want, maybe researchers or journalists who want particular information, and they use the website and visit it regularly to get information that they're using. But there's also a group that is interested in knowing information about Parliament without getting into the details. And so for that group, we had to create a live Twitter feed and daily and almost hourly updates of what was going on. And the consumption of that is much better. So for them, where you say, this is the bill, no one's going to read the bill. However, when you say, this is the bill and these are the 10 issues that the bill addresses, you find 60 people responding and say, well, you know, that clause doesn't make sense, why don't we change it? Rather than, and so once you've broken it down like that, then you get more consumption. So I think it's really about knowing which audience you want to target and then looking at the data sets that you have and repackaging it to be able to reach that audience. And also, I think an important aspect is understanding how that data will be used, because ultimately when people are consuming data, you want people to be able to use this data for some sort of action. So how are they going to use it? It's important to know information about the street maps, for example, is a good example. It's important to know streets and having a street map, and I've seen a beautiful showcase there. But the question is who and how are they going to use it? So for example, we were chatting with Alex earlier and I was saying, well, I'm not so sure how successful street maps would be in Kampala itself with how many boda-bodas we have. In Kampala, you have motorcycles, which we call boda-bodas, that are used for public transportation and can take you from one place to another. And the boda-bodas know the city so well, they can take you anywhere. And so most times, even when you're driving and you're not sure where you're going, most people maybe park and jump on a boda boda and it will take you there. If you're running late, you jump on a boda, it will take you there. So someone creating an app that shows the fastest routes or shows street names may not find it as successful as maybe someone who develops an app that shows you where you can find a safe boda boda that will ensure you won't get an accident.
I just want to jump in here at this point and say that I think what we also need to do as the community that generates data is to understand that we need to go beyond just putting out stuff out there and hoping that someone is going to use it. I think what we need to think about is data analytics, and I think this is where we need to get some real investment in trying to do the analysis and sense making of that data. And that also presupposes that we should constrain ourselves to imagine what sorts of questions or concern the user community might have of the data, and have some differentiated analytics that basically would respond to a variety of possible questions and concerns people might have, and the kinds of sense they want to make of that data. And this must be complemented by a robust public outreach and communication. People ought to know that that stuff is out there, and there's going to be some sensitization, but I think it also has to go into the school system, into the education system, working with the media and other communities that help citizens to be more engaged and more assertive in terms of their rights and articulating what it is that they need. So I think it's all hands on deck. It can't just be a process where certain generators of data put the data out there and they think that through some magical way, some people out there called users will find it and will try and do something about it. I think we need to think about the whole value chain around data and information and move our societies in terms of investments in public institutions, but also in awareness and literacy around what data is and how this relates to the things that we care about, and in this context, sustainable development.
So, speaking of unique users, I don't know if we've also thought about the fact that there are governments that deliberately publish data on the wrong platform, where there's no demand for it. So I know that the Ministry of Finance data for Nigeria has been published for a long time in newspapers, but guess what? Nobody buys newspapers. The total circulation of newspapers in Nigeria today, in a country of 170 million, is less than 500,000. The total number of newspapers sold. Most newspapers will tell you we're the most widely read newspaper, and you would think they sell 1 million, but all of them sell 500,000. Where the data demand is online. And when anyone online requests for data, you will probably be given a photocopy, which by the time you scan, I don't know if you've been given the photocopy of a photocopy of a photocopy of a photocopy, that when you scan it, even the PDF version is literally unreadable. So I think that, yes, so we are speaking about making sure that demand meets the platform, but I think we also need to speak, to the fact that there are people who are deliberately publishing where there's no demand, so that there will be no conversation around this. And I think it's something that demands, some attention also.
I wish I had Nigerian problems, only 500,000 newspapers a day. So I guess the key question here then is, how do you measure success? Is success when governments and citizens get to work together in a more efficient way? Is success when you change one person's life, 100 people's lives, 1 million? What is success in a piece of data journalism or a data product? And I'll take answers from whoever's brave enough.
So I think, and I'll speak to success on 3 levels, beginning with government. So I think success for government in demand and getting data is when your government is able to get the right data to help with planning and decisions. So for example, one of the reasons why we have 36 states in Nigeria is not because we need 36 states. It's a very political reason. People know that allocations will go. So there are people actually clamoring for new states to be created now, because the more states you have, the more places, the more destinations money can go to, and the intention is really not always to use the money to develop. So there are times when people make these decisions, oh, let's create more states from 12 to 36 and all that. But I think success is when planning is based on data. When you find that more roads are constructed in certain areas because there is a migration to that area or things like that. That's on government level. I think on the private sector level, success is when data becomes content, when data becomes the raw material. And I always use the example of programmers because that is the constituency that I work with day in, day out. An average young person building an app on education, on health, on agriculture needs content. You need to understand, otherwise, if technology is useless without context. So the context is where the data comes in, and I think that is what we can define as success. So when that data provides enough context that when what I create becomes, something useful. A very simple example. So we've got M-Pesa became a success as a mobile money platform in Kenya and everywhere else. People were trying to replicate that success. But unfortunately, the replication of the success was because of the numbers that people were seeing from M-Pesa. So in many places, it failed. But in places, and we looked at the data together for Tanzania and for a few other places, the places where it succeeded, it was because this same product that had succeeded in Kenya was filling a gap because there was the context and data was there to prove it. And so that's why you see that over the years, people who have been used to the informal banking systems are now primarily the people who are beginning to use their mobile phones for these payments. And for citizens, I think success is when open data becomes the basis for that conversation around social contract. Social contract literally doesn't exist in many of our countries. But I think that when citizens know, for example, that, you were speaking to, and I think that some of this conversation about budget not being understandable is deliberate. Because if the budget is not understandable, I have a theory, apologies to the medical doctors in the house. Medical doctors scribble so that you can't read well, because if you can understand, you won't come back to them. Because the next time you have a headache, you read what they wrote for you that time. And I think governments behave the same way. Give them information the way they can't read it, so that when you say it next year, they spend 6 months arguing over what exactly is the clause that was there in education and all that. So success in data for citizens is when it becomes a basis for social contract, which was an example that I always love to give. Nobody went on the streets to protest about government expenses on food in Nigeria until it was broken down to the fact that, oh my God, the presidency spends $5,000 equivalent in the morning for breakfast. Rich breakfast, isn't it? $5,000 for lunch and then $5,000 for dinner. Then people were like, okay, this is mad. We need to react to it. But before then, it was couched in some information that looked, unreadable.
Thank you for that very moving pro-government speech. Would anybody like to offer a rebuttal or an addition?
Yes, it's just to inform him that when we use digitals, then the handwriting tends to disappear. And it's not hiding everything. When the doctors, I have to protect the doctors who are prescribing. This is because of handwriting. But as soon as when they go digital, then you can see clearly, and they actually have a tendency not to use trade names and to use actually chemical name. And that's why when you are a drug of analgesics which relieve pain, they are different ones, so they can choose anyone. But this is also the same to the budget. It's really the question, how do you turn the data, how you transform data into information? And you can use different techniques to make those ones to be available, because as they've said clearly that if you are a researcher, you have a tendency to present the data to your own research, to your own constituency. But what is the most important, a good example here in Tanzania, when you mention about the budget, we mainstream on how budget is being done at the district level. And there we develop tools which will be assisting on resource allocation. And those ones you can align the burden of disease and resource allocation and intervention. And those could be visualized in a bar chart. That was much simpler way for even an ordinary person to understand this is the level of your problem and this is the small resources we have allocated. That we need to simplify that part, and that part is the most important. And it's also going to vary according to different audiences. When you talk with politicians, the language has to be different, and they have to, if you put up a league table for them to be able to understand, but showing the data by itself without showing them the strategies which are being used to achieve those results are not very helpful. So you need to align the data and what is the government supposed to present, and you have to be able to explain the differences. Why do you see these differences? That's actually making more sense.
What is success? And I want to look at it from a citizen-government relationship. Success of data is when the data makes sense and is able to spur action from a citizen's point of view. Success is when a statistic or data as simple as, well, this is simple after all the hard work in collecting it has been done. Data as simple as 16 mothers die every day in Uganda spurs action. Success is when you hear 16 mothers die every day in Uganda, you realize that when your sister died in the hospital, that was not a single accident. That's because there's a general problem now. Then you think about 16 mothers dying every day and you realize that because there are no drugs in the hospital, there could be a problem. That line, 16 mothers dying every day, could push a whole organization to sue the government over maternal health. That line could spur thousands of people to sign a petition to the government against exporting medical workers to another country, because how can you export medical workers to another country when you have 16 women dying every day trying to give birth? That's success in a relationship between government and citizen. If the data that you're putting out there from the government is able to resonate with the system and with citizens, they're able to understand it, digest it, and use it to get more accountability from the government and to have better service delivery from the government.
Thank you very much. So we have about 10 minutes for questions. Do we have a roving microphone? There's a question in the back. Does anybody have a roving microphone?
Yeah. My name is...
Oh, great. Right. Thanks, Stephen.
Oh, sorry.
Carry on.
Okay, my name is Samuel Bequin from Ghana. I work for the Natural Resources Governance Institute. I think I would just want to ask one question about I think there could be other projects. And in a country like Ghana where online presence is still less than 50%, way less than 50%, people are now using the radio, which is one of the best media conduit, to actually demand for more information and actions. And that comes to what our lady said, when the success would mean when that data breaking down is able to spark accountability in the sector.
I think that's a fantastic example because you're talking about how the actual piece of data or piece of data journalism, its impact doesn't end with the first user. It actually trickles down and can be used in other ways on different platforms. That's exactly the example I was looking for. Thank you.
I'm sorry, I'm going to have to contribute to the Ghanaian conspiracy of Ghanaian and Nigerian responses. Anyway, my name is Emmanuel. I work with radio in Ghana. I have a question. It's a little bit of a concern because, and it's related pretty much to the question I asked earlier, which was about linkages between Addis and Tanzania. But more specifically, here's the case that you have an Africa Data Consensus, which has institutional partners, African Development Bank, African Union Commission, the ECA, and in this case, you have the World Bank. But we are still not talking about the regional space. What is it that we need to do to begin having a conversation in which we draw in ECOWAS, East African Community? Because I would have thought that a conference like this would necessarily, for example, have
had invitees from the East African community to sit in this meeting, possibly members of the media to be embedded in a meeting like this, to be able to also begin picking up some of the only regional thing that we had was the 2-day boot camp this week. And there was an intervention on SADC and pharmaceuticals, which I thought was a very good example of the future. Because in West Africa, for example, we like to travel. Because of the visa-free travel, we can move freely across borders. We're not going to talk about traveling by air because that's way too expensive. But for example, we could have data in which we want to get to the place where we see data, for example, on the kind of airlines in the sub-region, how much the airlines cost, the frequency of the flights, all these things. For example, which SIM card, which telcos are operating in particular members of in particular member states, so that in the event of travel, we know that, okay, here's a table in which these are the telcos that operate in this country when we are traveling, so we don't need to be scrambling for roaming and all these other things. So my point really is just to illustrate the fact that we are still not having, we're not talking across purposes as such, but we're not having a conversation about the regional. I, as an individual, don't quite know how we can begin to speak to that, but I think before we leave this conference, we need to start really thinking about that, because for me, we run the risk of it being an institutional setup of African Development Bank, AUC, and all these other ones. Not to say that what they're doing is a bad thing, not at all, but we need the regional space because that is where a lot of Africans these days are identifying more with the regional, even as the national is important. The regional is becoming an increasingly important space. So, for example, all the solutions that you've offered, how would you relate that to the regional space, for example? And these are some of the things, in my view as an individual, I'm a bit concerned that we are not talking about. So if we could, especially in a post-MDG world, that kind of conversation, in my view, is very, very critical. Thank you.
Would anybody like to respond to that? That's an excellent point about local versus national.
Yes, I fully agree with you. I think this is the first conference we have made in Africa, and usually some of the things start small and growing up. But there are initiatives which is happening across Africa. For example, one which I've been involved is Data Machinery Institutions, which is a network of more than 13 countries in Africa where people are visiting household after every 3 months. They are collecting data. They are generating data on birth, death, migration, socioeconomic status on almost on daily basis. These are the people who are doing it on daily basis. And there is a network within Africa which is actually doing that. They are the most successful in generating mainly timely data at local level. The question is they don't have access with some of the players you have mentioned, African Development Bank, World Bank, and others. So those are the part of the most important. So when we start with small constituencies, I'm sure in the next few years we are going to have more and more people, and we are supporting more and more local initiative in generating and use of the data. The example which I've mentioned in terms of using the burden of disease and resource allocation is being initiated in Tanzania, now it's actually used in Ghana and also Burkina Faso.
I can take one more very quick question again, because that man's flashing a sign at me.
Yeah, thank you. I must commend your session. It's quite very rich, and I come up with this slogan, data for money, because we all use money. So if you change the concept open data to data for money, citizens will be interested. Let me give you an example. If the university has a research on soil health, citizens will know what is required to fix the soil, not just to buy fertilizer. So I think the other way around is data for money. Citizens will flow. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So it's time for us to end. I'm afraid this man's flashing a big red sign at me. I'm going to have to, if you have any more questions, you can address it to the panel afterwards, I think. Okay. So just from my perspective, I just want to put out there that I think the assertion that ordinary citizens do not want to use data is patronizing and insulting to ordinary citizens. And I believe that it's a very simple process of asking people what they need, or them telling you what they need, and then building something that's fit for that purpose. So I reject out of hand the idea that data journalism can only be effective for a certain privileged class. On that note, thank you very much for attending. I'd like to thank our panel, and if you could please give them a round of applause.